want to welcome you all to Acquiring Aquinas. We're looking at many articles in the Summa Theologiae that say lots and lots of things. What we're trying to do in these videos is really to break down each of the articles into its most fundamental parts, looking at what he's specifically arguing for, what the reasons are for the beliefs that he's presenting, and the ultimate conclusion. We're looking at Part 1, Question 1, Article 3, whether sacred doctrine is one science. As an overview of this particular article, we can look at the topic, inquiry, answer. The topic question, or the more broad category of investigations that he is looking into here, is question 1, the nature and extent of sacred doctrine. So really trying to get a sense of what sacred doctrine is. The article inquiry is whether sacred doctrine is one science. What this article is really looking at is the unity of the science known as sacred doctrine, that it is one science and not, say, a compilation of many different investigations or science. Aquinas' answer is that sacred doctrine is one science. So first we'll look at two main objections that Aquinas identifies here that concludes the opposite of what he's going to claim, which is that sacred doctrine is not one science. The first objection argument has as the major premise, all sciences treat primarily of only one genre of subjects. No sacred doctrine treats primarily of only one genre of subjects. Thus, sacred doctrine is not one science. So let's look at the argument in favor of the major premise. So Aquinas cites, in this context, posterior analytics of Aristotle, once again, namely that science is one which treats only of one class of subjects. And we can give it as an example here, the mathematician. So the mathematician treats primarily the class of subjects known as mathematical objects, such as numbers and geometrical objects. And so one need not look beyond the particular subjects that are being investigated to identify whether there is a unity to that investigation or not to determine it as a science. The minor premise, no sacred doctrine treats primarily of only one genre of subjects. Aquinas identifies that in sacred doctrine there is the investigation and treatment of both the creator and the creature, and these two cannot be grouped together as one class of subjects because God is not part of the created order. He's really distinct from the created order, and so it would be problematic to group those two together as one genre of subjects. The second objection argument has as the major premise, no investigation that treats of different philosophical sciences is one science. The minor premise, sacred doctrine is an investigation that treats of different philosophical sciences. And then, of course, the conclusion, thus sacred doctrine is not one science, and this is contradictory to the answer. The major premise is fairly straightforward, since the very idea of being a philosophical science is that it is one science. In other words, there is some kind of unity that brings in the unification here of this investigation to demarcate it as a philosophical science. For example, the science of natural philosophy treats of bodies in motion, metaphysics studies being qua being, etc. The minor premise, sacred doctrine is an investigation that treats of different philosophical sciences, is once again he looks at the particular things that are involved with sacred doctrine and what it investigates or teaches, and it involves things like angels, corporeal creatures, human morality, etc., each which belong to separate philosophical sciences. For example, angels will be treated by that science that investigates the phenomenon of the heavens. Corporeal creatures, on the other hand, will be addressed in natural science. Human morality will be covered by ethics. Each of these will relate to separate philosophical sciences. Now we turn the corner here and look at the orienting argument, the on the contrary argument that Aquinas gives. Major premise, all knowledge of holy things given by wisdom is one science. The minor premise, sacred doctrine is knowledge of holy things given by wisdom. Thus, sacred doctrine is one. Now, in terms of support for the major premise, he looks to Holy Scripture and a particular passage from the Book of Wisdom 10:10. He says that Holy Scripture speaks of this sacred doctrine as one science, and he says, quote, wisdom gave him the knowledge of holy things. Now, in terms of the minor premise, this is based on what the nature of sacred doctrine itself is. Divinely inspired knowledge of that which pertains to God is really what sacred doctrine is. So the minor premise is sort of true by the nature of sacred doctrine doctrine itself. And so the conclusion follows that sacred doctrine is one science. We next move to the best argument for the answer that sacred doctrine is one science, and there's one argument that Aquinas gives here. All habits that have an object unified under a precise formality is one science. Minor premise, sacred doctrine is a habit that has an object unified under a precise formality, and then the conclusion, sacred doctrine is one science. Now, in supporting the major premise, he really needs to get into this idea of a faculty or a habit, and how the idea of a formal object or an object works with respect to bringing a kind of unification or formality to the thing that it pertains to. Specifically, he says that the unity of a faculty or habit, which would be associated with knowledge or obtaining knowledge, is not unified in its material aspect, let us say by the individual subjects that it investigates, but as regards the precise formality under which it is an object. So the formal component which unifies it as its object of investigation. And he gives us a very helpful example here. He says that, for example, man, ass, stone agree in the one precise formality of being colored, and color is the formal object of sight. So even though man, ass, stone are all very different things, one is a living thing, the other is a non-living thing, one is a non-rational animal, one is a rational animal, with respect to the formality in terms of the object under which it is unified, sight brings it under the aspect of being colored. So this is not the unity that comes through the individual things that are being studied, but by the formality of the object itself that studies it, such as in this case, sight. So similarly with respect to knowledge and demonstration or science, we need not be bothered by the fact that sacred doctrine or some particular science doesn't just have one kind of subject that it studies, but rather the unification comes through a more formal understanding. Now, in terms of the minor premise, sacred doctrine is a habit that has an object unified under a precise formality. We need not look beyond the particular or precise formality under which sacred scripture undertakes its investigation, and that is that which is being divinely revealed. And that whatever has been divinely revealed possesses the one precise formality of the object of the science that brings unity to the science. So in this counter to the objection arguments, Aquinas objects to the minor premise, which is no sacred doctrine treats primarily of only one genre of subjects. Instead, Aquinas argues that sacred doctrine is that which treats primarily of only one class of subjects, or one genre of subjects. So although sacred doctrine does treat of both creatures and God, it does primarily treat of God in this primary way, and creatures only so far as they are referred to God or understood through the lens of God as an explanation, for example, as their beginning or their end. Now, in terms of the second objection argument, interestingly, Aquinas objects to that claim that no investigation that treats of different philosophical sciences is one science. He wants to leave room for this as a possibility and give some examples for how this is possible. So he argues that some investigations that treat of different philosophical sciences are, in fact, still one science. He uses the example of the working of habits or faculties and the ordering that lower ones can have to higher ones to make his point. For example, you have the particular five senses, each which have their own habits or objects, but they themselves are able to be unified under a higher faculty or habit, which is known as the common sense. The common sense is a faculty by which we can make judgments about what is or isn't occurring with respect to any of the particular five senses. And in this way, although one faculty itself, the common sense extends to all the objects of the five senses. So we can bring this to the notion of knowledge, such that there may be many objects which are the subject matter of various different philosophical sciences, and yet these can themselves be treated by a higher order of knowledge, particularly in this case, the one single sacred science, being one aspect under which these various objects are studied. namely as that being given by divine revelation. And so in this way, sacred doctrine can be a unified science.